bless you. And William Tong will be here. So we'll have the 4 candidates coming. We are going to be filming this. It'll be filmed for Guilford Community Television. So my request here will be if the speakers are able to pretty much stay at a podium or near them in front of the podium or walk really slowly so they can track with the camera, that will be great. Okay, because we would like to put this up. We'll put it up on our own YouTube channel and it'll go up on GCTV as well. Okay, our format for this morning is a little bit different, of course. So I will give a very brief introduction of the Attorney General and some of his accomplishments. He'll speak for hopefully about 20 minutes or so, and we'll follow that with Q&A to the Attorney General. We're going to follow that, and again, we're going to be pretty crisp about that, trying to be 5 or 10 minutes in the interest of having everybody have a chance to speak and ask any questions. So questions, please keep them kind of crisp, if you would. The next 20 minutes or so, we're going to have each of the candidates speak for a few minutes each, so the 4 Attorney General candidates, and again, we'll follow that with Q&A. After that, we'll have announcements, they'll be brief, and then we're going to separate into our different groups. Okay, so immigration will go across the hall, get out the vote in the back of this room, and environment will be in the front. And we'll repeat all of that. And again, just know that people are going to be drifting in, so there might be some interruptions and some noise interruptions, whatever. Okay, so in reading the Attorney General's bio, it was no surprise to me when Paul Doyle came in and said, so, you got the big shot here. I thought, well, so I could just introduce him as the big shot Attorney General George Jepsen. Turns out he is the 24th Attorney General to serve the state of Connecticut. So for those of us who may not have known all that much about what does the Attorney General actually do, the Attorney General is a constitutional officer and chief legal officer for civil matters. He's got a staff of about 200 attorneys, and they serve as legal counsel to all of the state agencies. They've got an operating budget of $30 million, but last year, in the last fiscal year, the fiscal year that ended June 30th, 2017, the office generated $636.3 million in revenues to the state, which is an unbelievable achievement. That's a 20-fold return on investment. Okay, so how do they do that? I'm going to just sort of give a couple of the bullet points so that we can get right on to the talk. Attorney General Jepsen was among the state attorneys generals who helped to negotiate a $25 billion federal-state settlement in 2012. It was the largest in history, with the nation's 5 largest banks over mortgage foreclosure abuses. I'm just going to read a few of these, of course. Connecticut played a prominent role in a number of notable multi-state cases. Connecticut joined Texas with the Federal Justice Department investigating e-book pricing that led to settlements with 5 publishing companies in 2012 and 2013, $166 million in consumer refunds, and a successful federal suit against Apple for its role in the anti-competitive scheme that netted $400 million for consumers. You know, we don't usually hear about the positive side of money. So I was actually, personally, I was a bit surprised to read just how many of these lawsuits have been incredibly beneficial of really holding the feet to the fire of large, in this case, corporations, who have, well, I'm trying not to say totally screwed Connecticut, but it's not working, so I'm just going to keep moving on. Connecticut led an intensive investigation of financial ratings agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's. Investigation and lawsuits resulted in $1.375 billion federal-state settlement with Standard & Poor's in February 2015, and nearly $864 million settlement with Moody's in 2016. Everyone knows about the Volkswagen diesel issue that happened, right? With vehicles equipped with illegal emissions defeating devices. Connecticut was one of 6 lead states in a coalition of more than 40 attorney generals that investigated that VW for marketing, selling, and leasing those. Investigation led to a $570 million settlement in June of 2016, and Connecticut's share of the civil penalties was approximately $16 million. Connecticut currently is leading a 47-state, multi-state lawsuit in federal court against 6 generic drug makers alleging illegal conspiracies in order to unreasonably restrain trade, artificially inflate and manipulate prices, and reduce competition for 2 generic drugs. Of the many, many accomplishments, focusing on healthcare, focusing really on the opioid epidemic, it's just gone all over the place. So without further embarrassment and accolades, not to mention that he's fluent in Mandarin and a former marathon runner, I'm introducing you to our esteemed Attorney General, George Wilson.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. My Mandarin is pretty rusty these days, but I don't get many chances to use it. I'm going to wrap a framework around our approach to dealing with the Trump administration. The work of the Attorney General's office goes on day to day, and this is kind of an overlay on top of all the work that my 200 lawyers do. And I wish I didn't have to do it, but it has been a very interesting ride, I can tell you that. And a couple things just to understand how we do the work. There's a continuum out there, and at one end of the continuum are issues that are essentially policy in nature, where there's not much of a legal hook to work with. Something like defunding Planned Parenthood, for example, that's more of an appropriations issue than a legal issue. We've tried to develop some legal hooks, but and so the reaction to what the Trump administration is doing on something that's more or less pure policy might be in the realm of shining a light on it, getting state attorneys general to co-sign a letter of protest. At the other extreme are issues where we have a legitimate legal hook, which is to say, for example, enforcement of the Clean Air and Clean Water Act by the EPA is state attorneys general are under federal law charged with enforcing those federal laws on the ground. So there's plenty of opportunities. I can talk a little bit about that in just a minute. And then there's the kind of things in the middle. Uniquely among the 50 state attorneys general, I have no criminal jurisdiction. So if you knock over a 7-Eleven or deal drugs or get in a bar fight, I have nothing to do with that. Things like that are dealt with a parallel organization, the Office of Chief State's Attorney. What that means concretely in terms of the work that we do in the office is that on a number of issues, immigration really comes to mind because that is such an overlap together with criminal law. I don't have any formal jurisdiction. What that means is that my office might, and as we have, sign on to amicus briefs that are being written by other states similarly situated in support of those state attorneys general who do have jurisdiction on issues like this. With respect to the travel ban, for example, we just don't have the facts on the ground to justify Connecticut's direct involvement. We tried to develop the case, but we couldn't find a state hook for that lawsuit. So we signed an amicus brief in support of efforts by my colleagues like Doug Chen and Bob Ferguson in Hawaii and Washington State, respectively, in support of their work. But there's still, having said that, there's still plenty of opportunities for Connecticut to participate directly in court going after Trump executive actions. And so just to run through several of them, the major ones, we have probably over 30 or close to 40 legal actions going on right now. But in terms of the larger, more interesting ones, there's a big cluster of environmental issues because, as I mentioned, we do have enforcement authority of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. And so we're about to go into court. The most recent issue is Scott Pruitt's effort to roll back President Obama's Clean Power Plan to confront climate change. We're together with New York. Connecticut is downwind from just about every state in the country, so whatever they're burning in Ohio or Georgia or Western Pennsylvania today, we're going to be breathing tomorrow. So we are in court to force the EPA to enforce what's called a good neighbor provision within the Clean Air Act, which which it essentially says you're not allowed to pollute downwind states' air. And so we're in court to force the EPA to hold 5 upwind states from Connecticut accountable for the pollution that they're causing for all of us. We're together with New York. We're going after a specific power plant, massive power plant called Lunar Island in western Pennsylvania, trying to again require the EPA to do what it's legally required to do in that respect, which is to shut this coal, force modification of this high sulfur content coal burning plant. We're also active on issues like challenging mileage standards and emission standards for light trucks and cars that the EPA would like to roll back. And so a big cluster of significant environmental issues. Then there's a whole diverse array of other issues as well, everything from, we're together with other states opposing the Trump administration's intent to put a citizenship question on the 2020 census. We're in court seeking to overturn the FCC's repeal of the Obama regulations for net neutrality. We're in court to oppose Trump's executive order banning transgender individuals from serving in the military. Texas is leading with a lawsuit that's, we think, too cute by half, an effort to overturn the Affordable Care Act. We're in court opposing that. Trump's executive order on we're repealing DACA. We're challenging with again, a coalition of Democratic state attorneys general on that front. Betsy DeVos's efforts to repeal Obama-era regulations that protected consumers from predatory marketing practices by for-profit universities. And so the list goes on and on. I think what I can tell you is that, again, while I wish it weren't happening, there are 23 Democratic state attorneys general this year, knock on wood, we hope to add to the ranks. But we talk every week. We have a Tuesday phone call where we compare notes. We talk about what is likely to happen in the coming weeks and months, and it might end up that we discuss, which state is going to take the lead on drafting those, since and having 23 states even doing their own work product, but find the state which has the best hook into confronting the Trump administration on a particular issue that we're going to anticipate and divvy up the work. So we take this very, very seriously, and I will continue to take it very seriously until I leave office. One of the nice things about being a lame duck attorney general is that I don't have to wear a suit to put on the jeans and come on out. I'd like to, and I'll turn over for questions in just a minute, but I'd like to pick up on some of the things that she said. The state attorneys, that's a positive thing. State attorneys general work very well on a bipartisan basis on dealing and confronting a lot of these national issues. And we have our partisan differences on some issues, but for the most part, we work extremely well together in the face of a Congress that's essentially paralyzed, and all the nastiness and that exists in partisan politics today. And so it has been a huge pleasure for me to work. Connecticut is probably more active than any state in the country on these multi-state investigations and lawsuits, and she mentioned the national mortgage foreclosure settlement. About $450 million, of debt relief came in for Connecticut consumers. About 6,000 Connecticut families were able to refinance their homes or get the principal of their loan reduced to bring it to a level of affordability. We did hold Wall Street accountable uniquely with Standard & Poor's and Moody's for mislabeling mortgage-backed securities as AAA in the lead up to the 2008 crisis, when in fact they were junk. a lot of the money from the Volkswagen settlement is being used, our share, we got money from the state really to consumers, but also a $1 billion plus fund, Connecticut share is $52 million, that we're going to use, it has to be used for clean air work, and we're going to assist the build out of Connecticut's electrical car infrastructure there. And then data privacy, Connecticut's the lead, the co-lead on investigating some of these national breaches, Target, Home Depot, Anthem Blue Cross, and most recently the mother of all data breaches, Equifax, which is sucking up a lot of resources from my office. The two most interesting ones that we're working on now are, and I can't take credit for this, smart lawyers in my office, so I figured it out. In the summer of 2014, some of my lawyers came in, they had read in the New York Times an article about a price spike in a generic drug, and they asked permission to investigate, which we gave them. Within 3 months, we were turning information over to the Justice Department, who initiated their own parallel criminal investigation, and we're alone among the states investigating this for about 2.5 years when it got just to be too much. And now we had a 47-state, again, bipartisan coalition investigating what is pervasive and systematic price fixing in the generic drug market. Generic drugs are about 88% of the prescriptions that are filled, and it's about a $75 billion industry, and there's a culture of corruption in that industry. Since we've been able to, we now filed in court last Halloween a suit identifying 15 drugs, 18 companies, including 5 of the 7 largest generic drug manufacturers, and 2 chief executive officers. I get briefed on a regular basis in my most recent briefing. We could put in play over 100 drugs now, and virtually the entire industry. This isn't like Hasbro and Mattel conspiring over Frisbee prices. These are drugs that people need to stay alive and for their health, and it forces choices that people shouldn't have to make between feeding their families and paying the rent and being having the health care that they need. But it's the generic drug manufacturers are clustered, about 40 of them are clustered in northern New Jersey and the suburbs of Philadelphia, and the executives and the salespeople, they attend the same conferences, they attend the same golf outings, they do girls' nights out, they actively conspire to fix drug prices, and it's an enormous issue that I think you'll be hearing a lot more about in the coming months and years. Opioids, the biggest public health crisis in the country right now, and 5 years ago, Connecticut had, I think, in 2012 actually, 350 opioid-related overdose deaths. We cracked 1,100 in 2017, and similar growth has occurred across the country. Connecticut joined the opioid multi-state investigation last year. We were asked to be on the executive committee. At that time, the multi-state was only investigating a single manufacturer. Connecticut pushed to and prevailed in persuading the multi-state to investigate the 6 largest manufacturers and the 3 largest distributors of opioids. We're now, it's by far the most complex multi-state that I've worked on, because you have hundreds of municipalities and counties that are suing And as well, we've been able to consolidate the case in federal action in Cleveland. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able in the last 3 months to do more than we did in the last year, but we're now actively negotiating with both the manufacturers and distributors. My concern is that there's a lot of folks who are analogizing the tobacco settlement with opioids, and this has created a rise in expectations. There just isn't the money in the opioid industry to sustain a settlement at the scope of tobacco, and so people are likely to be disappointed with whatever the outcome is. But this is an issue that touches just about the lives of everybody in this country, because even if you don't have an issue in your own family, it's very likely that your kids or grandkids know kids in school, other families that have been touched in one way or another. So, we hope to, I'd like to really, we're focusing very heavily on this issue. Our goal and our priority isn't so much to bring back money to states, but to fund treatment and prevention and conduct relief so that companies don't use this kind of practices that they did that led to the current situation. So there are interesting things going on outside of the Trump world, and I'll close my comments right now and see what questions you might have.
Thanks. Second, while we get microphones working.
Yeah, hi, I'm Terry Kane from Guilford, and I'm also chair of the environment team here at CTSI. Thank you. You answered the question I was going to ask you, and that was about, the clean power, and so you're doing the right thing in the environment, and we really appreciate that. So really, this is for my education, the question I'm going to ask you now. I saw the Union of Concerned Scientists ranking of the states on the clean energy momentum that states are taking, and Connecticut is not even in the top 10. And it seems like the lead is being taken by California and the Attorney General there. I'm just wondering, on technical progress, the number of jobs that clean energy can create, the progress the state makes on policies to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency and carbon reduction. What else can an Attorney General do in Connecticut to bring us up to that top 10?
The policies that would implement carbon reduction are taken by our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We have a very robust environmental department within my office. I'm not aware of any case that anybody's wanted us to take that we haven't taken. I think it's really about what the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection policies that they're following.
Right, okay, great, thank you.
I only have one question for you. So is there a website or a place where all of us who now have learned an incredible amount about what AGs do, is there a place where we can actually follow what your office is doing?
Yeah, just go to my website. We have all of our press releases are there, and the issues, opinion letters, and the issues that we're working on.
And the website is georgejepson.com, or the website is cga.eg.bigshotgeorgia.com. Which how do we
Carol.
We'll follow.
If you go on ag.ct.gov, that's the website for the Attorney General for the state of Connecticut. Everything is over there. The public opinion, the press releases, and the complaints are also attached over there. You can follow up with everything. If you have a question, just call the office. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Attorney General. Does anyone else have other questions before we, yeah, please, ma'am. We're going to have just a few questions before we move on. Please.
I just wanted to ask, since we have candidates here that are running for your office, what do you think are the capabilities or experiences that are most valuable in this position, so that we can make a decision going forward as to who should be elected?
That's a very good question. What I've come to appreciate about the office is that its most important asset is its credibility. Because people really want to, in the external political environment, want to be able to use what we do either as a sword or as a shield to advocate on whatever they're doing. And then I'm not being critical of anyone, but whether it's a legislator or a commissioner or the governor's office or an advocacy group, they want to be able to say, I spoke to the Attorney General or I spoke to someone on the staff and they said, and it supports my position. And so protecting the credibility of the office is incredibly important to me. And to do that, to be credible, you have to be willing to say no to your friends when, and not twist the law to take a particular ideological position. And you have to play, there's plenty of room for advocacy, as I remarked with the various lawsuits that we're working on the Trump world. But it's just very, very important that you understand that the office is an institution whose integrity has to be protected. And that's the number one issue for me. And because when you are credible, it means that when you say things that are not popular, people may wish it were otherwise, but they're accepting of it. So, to give an example, I 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, I opined that Connecticut's statutory spending cap was unenforceable, and I got zero blowback from Republicans or from conservative groups because they know that on legal issues like that, I played it completely straight, and they read the opinion letter, and it was kind of indisputable. Connecticut, my office has been kind of the honest broker of the whole process for whether or not Connecticut is going to put a slots parlor in East Windsor to kind of hedge against casino expansion in Springfield. The tribes may not like it when we say certain legal procedures have to be adhered to, but some legislators who support the tribes may not like it when we say it, but everybody accepts the validity of what we're saying. That we don't take sides on an issue of whether a casino should go at all anywhere, or whether it should be in Bridgeport or a slots parlor in East Windsor. Credibility is everything.
George, first, thank you for all you've done, and I hate the thought that in your lame duckness you'd be bored. Could I suggest an area you might want to explore before you go? ICE has been stalking our courthouses and hunting undocumented immigrants. They've been tackling them physically on their way in, dragging them out and spraying them with pepper spray in the courthouse. One of our volunteer lawyers had a pro bono family case last week, got a text from a colleague that ICE was in the halls and they had to leave. So people are in extreme danger. This is an outrage, I think. It undermines the whole judicial system. Is there anything your office can do about that?
I can certainly take a look at that. I take that very seriously.
Okay, last question.
This is the same question.
It was the same question. All right.
Terry Clark.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to move on to the candidates. Okay, so could we have we've got William Tong is here, we've got Claire Kindle here, we've got Paul Doyle here, and do we have Chris Maddy here too? Chris is on his way if he's not here yet. He went to the wrong church too. All right, I think what we're going to do is we're going to ask, we have all three candidates come up. You guys can kind of stand on the side, but And one by one, mostly because, one by one, we're going to ask each one of you to give a few-minute talk, up to about 5 minutes, and then once each one is done, we're going to ask people to ask questions. Again, to keep the questions crisp would be really helpful, so that enough people can ask the questions that they'd like to ask. All right, well, the lone man standing. I'm going to give it to Paul Doyle first. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Doyle. I'm running for Attorney General. Thank you for coming. It's a great turnout on a Saturday morning. And I want to thank George Jepson-Lees. I think he's done an excellent job as our Attorney General, as I think all of us do. I really admire his performance as Attorney General. We have a lot of forums. We had 5, now we have 4. The last 5 months we've gone to forums all over, and we've been asked, who's your role model to be Attorney General, whether Blumenthal or George Jepson. To me, I said George Jepson. I think he's been very deliberate. His decisions were based on the law, and he just emphasized what I've thought of when he talked about credibility for your next Attorney General. It's a very important thing. But about me, to be your next Attorney General, I think I have the legal experience, I have the public service experience, and I think I have the courage of my convictions. So briefly, I've been a lawyer for 26 years. I live in Wethersfield, and I've been, from day one, I've worked for small firms. I never wanted to work for big firms, so I've worked in the greater Hartford area, small firms, work with people like you, issues you have every day. So I get to see face-to-face, do work, and I think that's kind of what I'm all about. In addition to that, during my entire 26 years as a lawyer, I've been in public service. I served 3 years on Wethersfield Town Council, then I served 12 years in the State House of Representatives, and now I'm completing my 12th year in the State Senate. William and I are co-chairmen of the Judiciary Committee. We work together. Despite our candidacy, we're rivals. We said up front we're going to work together, and the session is almost over. I'm so proud. Well, we're candidates, but anyway, no, we both said other people in the past that ran for the same office really disrespected the legislative process, and I'm so proud that William and I worked very closely together. We did the people's work. We didn't let that mess up our job at the Capitol, and I'm just very proud that William and I did that. In my 27 years of public service, a lot of people have criticized me, my Republican opponents, and I'm a career politician. I've dedicated my life to public service, and I tell that to people, so I'm proud of my service. In addition to that, George mentioned credibility, and I think that's similar to doing what you think is right, regardless of the political costs, and I have a history of that. And last September, I made a very difficult decision. Some of you may disagree with it, but I did what I thought was right. We were in the middle of the budget process. It really was not going anywhere, so I made a controversial decision to support a controversial budget. I knew it was going to be vetoed, but I knew it would really shake things up, and it ultimately we achieved a bipartisan budget, which actually helped a lot of towns, including Madison and Ronnie, in terms of state aid, because the budget that was planned to be voted on would have hurt Madison in comparison to the final version of the budget. So that's an example where I made a difficult decision, but I think ultimately the bipartisan budget was good for the state of Connecticut, and actually I think it was also good for the Democratic Party. But George gave us a good background of what his office is currently doing against the Trump administration. I support George's efforts, and I'll be honest, we had 5 candidates. Now we're down to 4. All 4 of us are very quality candidates, and I believe all of us will properly challenge the Trump administration as we're talking about here. In just conclusion, I also think the job, it's not all about challenging the Trump administration. It's fighting for the people, being the people's lawyer. That's why I want a 24-hour hotline so you can contact me if I'm your next Attorney General with your concerns and problems. So again, I was told to stop, so thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker will be William Tong, who is also running for Attorney General, and he is currently representing the 147th District, going on 10 years? 12 years. And here he is to tell us about.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan.
Yep.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So I'm State Representative William Tong. I represent Stamford and Darien, and as Paul said, I'm the House Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which means I have overall responsibility with Paul for our state's entire legal system. It also means that we handle judicial nominations, and it was my honor to stand in the House of Representatives for several hours to fight back against the Republican smear campaign against Justice Andrew McDonald a few weeks ago. And I was proud to be able to get him through the House, but the Republican forces were too strong overall to get his nomination through the other chamber. But I must tell you that during that debate, there were several times when I looked over at my Republican colleagues, many of whom are usually reasonable, and I just thought to myself, how the heck did we get here? You know, because if you're like Andrew McDonald, who would have been our first openly gay Chief Justice, or if you're like me, my parents came here as immigrants, my father was at one point undocumented. Or if you're a woman, if you just want to breathe clean air and drink clean water, if you're a Connecticut taxpayer, it's pretty clear that Republicans across the country, here in Connecticut, and the President of the United States have declared war on you and your family. And that's why I'm running for Attorney General. Because this is a deeply personal fight for all of us. When the President was elected, there was a 20% spike in hate crimes across the country. We were not spared here in Connecticut. So I strengthened the state's hate crimes laws as chair of the Judiciary Committee, because I know what it is to suffer hate and bigotry and to have people come after your family. So I feel like I have a unique voice, maybe even a right to say to the President, if you think you're going to ride a wave of hate and bigotry and remake our world, you are going to have to come through me and all of us, and we are not afraid of you. And I say that because as Democrats here in Connecticut, we've taken on forces much more powerful than Donald Trump, and we've beaten them. As chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I took on the NRA. I wrote the domestic violence gun law. This week, it'll be my honor to lead the House, and hopefully we'll pass a ban on bump stocks and ghost guns on the 21st. I'm proud to be one of the architects of some of the strongest gun laws in the nation. At the height of the financial crisis, I wrote a law taking on the big banks to help thousands of Connecticut families stay in their homes. I rewrote the state's foreclosure laws. It's been my honor to take on a system of mass incarceration and criminal justice reform, writing the Second Chance Society law and the bail reform law and the excessive use of force law. And we fight every year on the Judiciary Committee for women and women's rights. This year in particular, we've passed important legislation to stop sexual harassment and sexual assault, and we've stopped every major encroachment on a woman's right to choose on the Judiciary Committee over the last several years. So let me close by saying I mentioned my experience not just for its own sake, but because this is a moment for the battle-tested because of the extraordinary risks that we face. And we've come face to face with one of those risks all too often of late. It was the Altaff family in New Britain, the Huang family in Farmington. For us in Stamford, it was Miriam Martinez. Miriam is a mom, she's an immigrant, and she's undocumented. And she has 2 teenage daughters, one of whom has diabetes. She and her husband do the very best they can for their 2 girls. But that didn't stop ICE from targeting Miriam and saying, get out, or we're going to throw you out. And so I was asked to go to her apartment for a vigil, and when I got there, I realized that her lawyers had dared ICE that day to forcibly come and take her out of her apartment. I realized very quickly I wasn't there for a vigil. I was there with clergy and elected officials as part of a human shield. I was also there because that very same order to get out was given to my own father almost 50 years ago in Hartford, Connecticut. But a compassionate man named Richard Nixon allowed him to stay. So, I'll wrap up. Before I left, I had a chance to meet Miriam, and as I gave her a hug, I looked down and I caught a glimpse of her ankle bracelet.
We call it a shackle.
Well, if you've never seen one of these things, it's a big, ugly piece of metal and plastic, and it has a loudspeaker on it so ICE can talk to you. And I can't tell you how chilling it is to see someone in your own town shackled like that. That is not who we are. That's not the world or the state that I want my kids to grow up in.
and that is why we fight.
Okay, our next candidate will be Claire Kindle, and with no further ado.
Thank you very much. That was a long 5 minutes. I'm Claire Kindle. I am a candidate for Attorney General. I have been a lawyer for the past 28 years, and for the past 2 decades, I have been your lawyer, serving as an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Connecticut, and it's a job I love. I've done a wide variety of complex public interest litigation. I was the lead lawyer in defending our firearms permitting system. I was the lead lawyer on the No Child Left Behind litigation. I have done environmental enforcement, consumer protection enforcement, and antitrust investigations into pharmaceutical pricing, version 1.0, where I think we're now at version 3.0. And for the past 6 years, I have been the department head of the energy unit in the AG's office, and my 3-lawyer unit has saved Connecticut electric ratepayers over $100 million. So why leave a job I love? Well, about 15 months ago, I boarded a bus for Washington, D.C. And I joined hundreds of thousands of women and men at the Women's March in D.C. And we were marching because we were really worried about the election of November 2016 and what it meant for our country and what it meant for our state. And did we have that right? And as Attorney General Jepsen has said, you know, as the federal government has really abandoned some pretty fundamental concepts and principles of our country, attorney generals across the states have had to step up and fill the gap. So rather than defending the environment, they're failing to protect the environment and young and healthcare access and consumer protection and labor and antitrust and net neutrality. Pick a topic. And attorney generals have had to step forward and really fill those gaps with enforcement. And so this is no time for training wheels. Experience does matter. Now, there was a question about, well, what kind of experience is best, and should you be a policy person or should you be a lawyer? And the answer is yes, you should be both. I've also been asked, well, why hasn't an assistant attorney general run before? And I think you can congratulate the Clean Elections Program. That makes it possible for those of us who don't have Rolodexes with people who can write very large checks on it, but rather it turns fundraising on its head. And rather than having a few people with large checks, you have a whole lot of people with relatively modest checks, and that makes it possible. The other thing is that as a state employee, I can't run in the legislature. I can't serve in the legislature. And typically, our candidates have come from the legislature. But I will say that my candidacy is a celebration and a reason for why the Clean Election Program works. Because I have the endorsement of over 50 of my colleagues. They know the mission, they know the job, and they know me. And they know that I have the fire in the belly, the leadership skills, the judgment, and the temperament to be our next AG. But there's more to the AG's office than Donald Trump, believe it or not. And there's a couple of issues. I think that the opioid crisis is going to be the mini tobacco settlement. I really do think that's the next mini tobacco. And I mean, think about it. There are over 60 sober houses in the city of New London alone, and not one of them needs to be registered or licensed. And I think we need to look into not only the opioid crisis, but the ripple effects from the opioid crisis. I also think that environmental protection and consumer protection is going to be the front line for the next Attorney General, because the federal government has abandoned environmental protection, and consumer protection has always traditionally been a state matter. But I have a couple of particular issues that I'm passionate about. One is student loan debt. Now, I grew up in Waterbury. My brothers are Waterbury firefighters. My sister's a special ed teacher. I went to Wellesley and the University of Virginia School of Law on scholarships and loans. And I was able to pay back my loans. Students today can't do it. They're in debt for 20 years, and their monthly mortgage, or it's a monthly mortgage payment to pay back those debts. And I grew up that education was a ladder forward, and I do think that that ladder has been impeded by what's been happening with student loans. So what can the AG's office do about it? Well, first of all, we can educate students on what their rights are. 2, I would advocate to change the law, and I don't have enough time to explain it, but I'll explain it later. And 3, I would vigorously pursue the predatory lending practices of various entities and the educational institutions that churn students up without getting them with high debt and no degree. And of course, that's why Betsy DeVos issued a memo saying, oh, well, we don't think the states have anything to do with that. And I would vigorously fight that with every tool in the toolbox. The other issue is the do not call list. Now, who here answers their landline? Who here answers a phone without checking their caller ID? And who has answered a call, checking their caller ID, finding that they've called themselves? My mother's 89. She lives in the house I grew up in Waterbury. She has, she has a cell phone. She doesn't use it. She only uses a landline. And out of her 10 calls, 7 will be somebody saying that she's going to get arrested by the IRS, that her Windows operating system is broken even though she doesn't have a computer, that she's wanted a trip someplace, that she needs her chimney cleaned, or some other kind of robocall. And the other 3 are one of her 4 children. But she answers it all 10 times because one of the 3 is going to be one of her kids. Well, if somebody came to your front door and banged on your front door 10 times a day, 7 days a week, you would be able to put a sign at your gate saying, no soliciting, no trespassing, do not disturb. I believe we should be able to do that for both our cell phones as well as our landlines. It's not an easy fix. I think there's a technology fix. I think there's a federal law fix. I think there's a state law fix. In conclusion, I am in very many ways the anti-Trump candidate. I am a progressive, pro-choice professional woman who is an expert in the job I am seeking. I'm exactly what I think the voters need this fall, but I can't do it without your support. So I look forward to taking your questions, and I hope I can earn your support. Thank you.
They would fight for. Because I never thought I was going to be a lawyer. What I thought I was going to be was a teacher. That's what I wanted to do with my life, and that's what I did. When I graduated from college, I went out to the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona to teach high school English in one of the most impoverished corners of the country, working with children who had next to nothing in life. They came to school hungry. They came to school with the same clothes every day. Many of them had experienced trauma at home because of substance abuse or domestic violence. And what I learned out there that has stuck with me to this day is that if you're born somewhere into deep, intractable poverty, there's very little chance for you to succeed in life. There's an exception to every rule, but I became very engaged in social and economic justice for that reason, and I became a union organizer. I started to organize low-wage hospital workers in Northern California, almost all of whom were women, almost all of whom were first-generation American. They were being exploited. They were being forced to work off the clock. So what that means is that if their shift started at 8, they'd have to come in at 7 and work for an hour without pay. And that's why I became a lawyer, because I really believed as a result of that experience that folks who were being exploited or taken advantage of, that they could have a voice if they had somebody who was willing to stand up and speak for them. And that's why I came back home to go to law school and became a Justice Department prosecutor. And I'm proud to say that in my 8.5 years at the Justice Department, we made a real difference for people in Connecticut. I started off leading our anti-gun trafficking efforts in New Haven. You all may know that a lot of the violence that we have, and particularly in our urban centers, is caused by out-of-state guns. Guns that are bought in states with lax gun laws and then trafficked up to Connecticut and dumped into our cities. So I started off leading a program called Project Safe Neighborhoods to prevent that. And then, as I said, ended up supervising all of our fraud and corruption matters, where I prosecuted John Rowland the second time around, where we went after people who were looking to defraud our citizens' election program, the kind of program that allows people like Claire and I, who have never run for public office, to actually run. We went after Democrats, too. Democrats who were looking to inject secret money into our campaign process. And on the fraud side, I'm proud to say that in Connecticut, We conducted one of the only investigations to result in criminal charges against Wall Street bankers for what they did in connection with the financial crisis. All of that work was about fighting the abuse of power. The abuse of power by people who are in positions of public trust, the abuse of power by people who are in positions of corporate leadership. And I know right now that the next Attorney General's job, when you boil it all down, is going to be to fight the abuse of power that's coming out of Washington and the Republican agenda that it represents. That's what we need right now. And all of these fights that we care about, on immigration, on guns, on net neutrality, on the environment, where we've seen EPA enforcement actions drop by more than 50% since Donald Trump took office. All of those fights are going to be waged in federal courtrooms over the next 2 years. And that's why I think it's important that we have somebody in the Attorney General's job, if we're serious about getting the job done right and winning, who has led public interest lawyers in the federal courtrooms before and won against some of the most entrenched interests in our society. That's what it's going to take. Connecticut can be a leader in that, and I'd be honored to have your support. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay. So again, we are going to open this up to questions. The questions can be directed to any of the four. You can direct them generally however you would like. We are aware that we are going over our usual effort at time, but I think this is just really important, and our whole advisory group feels it's just really important to see these folks, ask questions, and what I'm going to ask to do, I'm going to go cruising with these microphones, but I'm going to ask the candidates as they answer them to step up to this microphone, because we are filming it, as I said earlier, we are filming it. It will be put up on GCTV as well as on YouTube, and we will spread it far and wide so people can see these folks. Okay, questions? Jim.
Hi. Yes, can you gentlemen and lady explain to me how net neutrality is going to be acted on the state level?
Choose it, guys.
Well, there has been a proposal this legislative session to try and bring net neutrality to Connecticut. It didn't go through, in part because of Republican opposition. Connecticut's part of a lawsuit right now challenging the net neutrality repeal. And the arguments that are being made is that, number one, the process that led to the repeal was infected from the start with fraud, because some of you may know that more than 2 million comments were submitted by people with fraud who were fraudulently obtained identities. And number two, that the process was arbitrary and capricious because the Obama administration, as they were wont to do, was very deliberate and careful and exhaustive in the process that led to the determination that the internet should remain free and open. And within just a matter of months, the Trump FCC repealed that. And so that's the legal argument that's being made right now. I actually think we have a pretty good chance of being successful. Connecticut's a part of that, and I'm sure any one of us would continue that.
So follow, I am Vice Chairman of the Energy Committee, so because of the Trump's efforts to repeal the Obama net neutrality law, we did have the legislation that Chris mentioned. In the committee, I supported it, despite, and it really was defeated with the bulk of the Republican votes, and their argument was the state is preempted by federal law, you can't do it. I supported it. I mean, it's such an essential issue. I said to myself, I'll support it if it's challenged later on and struck down, so be it. But it was, unfortunately, did not even get out of committee because of opposition by the bulk of the Republican members of the committee, and a few others killed it. But I think it's worthy. We may have an amendment process in the next week and a half. We can pursue it because Chairman Bob Duff, the Majority Leader of the House, of the Senate, is very active in it. So I'm hopeful it'll come back. I was frustrated it didn't even get out of committee, but I personally voted for it. Thank you.
I think what we're seeing with the net neutrality legislation is the future. If we don't recapture the majority in the Senate and have a comfortable majority in the House. And we're seeing that on a lot of issues. Our state's gun laws, for example, which we have responsibility for. There's a lot more that we'd like to do that we can't do. So I think this speaks to why this campaign and this election is so important. Dick Blumenthal was an incredibly forceful advocate in the building, in the legislative office building. George is also strong, but Dick was really good about leveraging his legislative experience to come into the Capitol and the LOB and to advocate for legislation that yeah, candidly, he didn't have any authority over, but he understood the bully pulpit and the soft powers of his office. And you really need to understand how to move the levers of state government. And as we go forward, it's not just going to be net neutrality, it's taking on how big technology impacts all of us and contributes to the squeeze that we all feel in our everyday lives. I mean, I don't want to buy a new iPhone X because Apple wants to slow down my iPhone 5. So there are so many ways in which consumers are impacted, and we have to stand up and fight them.
Well, I couldn't live home with my 22-year-old son if I wasn't for net neutrality. I think anybody under 28 understands why it's so important. I believe net neutrality is actually an economic issue because it's very similar to the railroad lines of the turn of the last century. If you had a strong railroad line into your town prospered. And if you didn't have a railroad line or you had a slow, rickety one, then your town failed. And I think there's a good story about how Chicago came to be. So I believe that net neutrality is essential to our economic well-being and going forward. Obviously, the federal court case is the primary function of that. And I actually spoke to some telecom executives to say, well, listen, you know, why should I not be for net neutrality? And they said, well, you know, if the consumers have a problem or business have a problem, they can go to the Consumer Protection Board. Okay, really? You're really making that argument? And so they can sign arbitration clauses and mandatory class action waivers, and basically the Consumer Protection Board that it says our job is to eliminate regulation of businesses rather than actually protect consumers. So I said, you're going to have to do a better argument, and that's your argument, you lose. If the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There is more to dealing with this issue than just dealing with legislation. The Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act gives us a lot of tools in the toolbox in order to deal with the abuses of net neutrality, and attorneys general are not limited by arbitration clauses or class action waivers. We can bring sovereign CUPA cases, and as Attorney General, that's what I would do to ensure that the inevitable abuses that are going to happen when you eliminate net neutrality. I think it is a public utility, and I think it should be treated like a public utility, and you know that there's going to be small upstart businesses that are going to be restricted with respect to their access, and as your next Attorney General is going to have to be pretty vigilant and diligent and follow up and take legal action where necessary and press for legislation where necessary and take appeals where necessary. And that's what I would do. As well as that way I can stay home with my 22-year-old son. Thanks.
Next question is coming from Charlotte Evans. If several people have questions, again, we're going to ask they be crisp and short, and if we can line up, that'd make the whole thing go just a little bit quicker. So thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering whether the Office of Attorney General has had or should have a role in protecting the Connecticut ballot from foreign interference.
Yeah, certainly. There are a number of fronts in which that's important, and the AG can accomplish that. The AG has a broad mandate to pursue the public interest. Now, 95% of the job is the basic nuts and bolts of state government, child protection, child support enforcement, what Claire did on PURA. But the AG has a broad mandate to pursue the public interest, and that includes protecting our voting rights and enforcing our voting rights laws. I think one area in which we've seen so much foreign interference, obviously, is on the internet, right? And on Facebook and in social media, and that seems to be the frontier. They're not only telling us what to buy, but how to think and how to vote. And I think this speaks to the previous question about net neutrality and the big technology companies, that we sort of take it for granted that we've let them into our lives and that this is just a fabric of who we are now. But I think we have to remain really vigilant about how Cambridge Analytica, collected information surreptitiously about 50 million of us, and the tremendous risks that poses to us, not just over the security of that data, and if it were released to a big commercial firm or a foreign power, but also how it leads to real costs to all of us, like identity theft and the ways in which the financial markets and credit card companies make money off of data and targeting. So I think it's really important to take on Cambridge Analytica, to take on Facebook and Twitter and the big technology companies and conduct investigations into how they're protecting our data, but also safeguarding us against manipulation by foreign powers and interference in our elections.
Do you want all of us to answer all of these
We were
questions?
just kind of
Because,
discussing
we
it.
can all say, yep, that sounds good.
Everybody says, yep, that sounds good, I'm good with that, and we'll move on.
I mean, obviously, I think all of us can say quite a bit on all of these issues, so but in the interest of getting as many questions as possible, I leave it to your discretion. How do you want to handle it?
I would totally appreciate it if we can get more questions in, and if you guys kind of choose which one of you wants to take the
Sure.
question. And if
And then-
someone's got
and with
something
the right of rebuttal.
significantly
Yeah, there's something different.
different,
Yeah.
that
All
would be
right.
wonderful.
So my
Thank you.
answer here is yep.
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 Got it.
Chris, yep.
Hi, my question has to do with power inequality and it's rooted in economic inequality. And is there anything in the AG's office, is there a power within the AG's office to help workers, unions, workers' rights, and to help us alleviate economic inequality and power disparity in this country, starting in Connecticut? And I suspect Chris could answer this question super well, so I don't think he should. I think somebody else should.
I'll struggle through. The AG's office has a labor department, and it has a section of the agency where labor enforcement of labor rules, enforcement of collective bargaining, enforcement of the various specific rules that require, both for licensing, but also our employers following the rules. And there's a whole section of the AG's office that does it. And I think there's where, it matters who's your next AG. Because your next AG can put the energy into the labor department and protecting workers' rights and protecting those of us who work for a living. Or they can form a Second Amendment unit. And so, and say, okay, well, we want something that just protects people's rights to carry guns. I think everybody up here stands for the former, not the latter. But the AG's office also does civil rights investigations and housing discrimination investigations. And there's a great deal that the Attorney General's office does and can do, even more so, to protect people who work and to deal with those inequalities. So.
Yeah. Just want to throw one thing. I agree with everything Claire said, but there's also the angle of defensive. Depending what William mentioned about the election, depending what happens in November, if, God forbid, the Republicans took full control of the legislature and the governor's mansion, and one of us got elected as Attorney Generals, we all, and the Republicans decided to eliminate collective bargaining, it would be the responsibility of the Attorney General to challenge, to review and make a decision and potentially try to invalidate the action and file suit against them if they were to strike down on the collective bargaining. So that's a real issue. Depends on the election, but if Democratic governor, Democratic legislature, there wouldn't be an issue, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Clarice.
Yeah, my question is for trying to just give a voice to the people that can't vote, the immigrants. Would you be for having Connecticut becoming a sanctuary state like California?
So we have very significant sanctuary protections. Sanctuary is not a legal term, it's a concept. And the way we built that concept here in this state is the Trust Act, which on the Judiciary Committee is our responsibility. And the Trust Act basically says that immigration law and our system is a matter for the federal government, and it's not our job, state and local law enforcement, to do the federal government's job for them. So if they want to enforce the laws that we consider to be unjust and unfair, they can go ahead and do that, but we're not going to help them. And that's what the Trust Act says. Another law, and we tried to strengthen that this year, but we faced a lot of Republican opposition. In fact, they tried to strip and repeal the Trust Act last week in the House, and I jumped up and stopped them from doing that. The other thing that is important is we have a bill that we talked about when I walked in here, 5544, which would change the definition of a misdemeanor from 365 days to 364 days in Connecticut. And the reason why we're doing that is because if it's a 365-day misdemeanor, that's considered a felony at the federal level, and that triggers ICE enforcement. So it's this kind of work at the state level that puts together a patchwork of sanctuary, and again, speaks to the broad responsibilities of the Attorney General, not just to be a lawyer. Being a lawyer is necessary but not sufficient. It's a much bigger job running a state agency and being in the legislature advocating for and protecting laws like the Trust Act and this misdemeanor law that we're proposing.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I did want to just respond to that issue because some of you know that we have 10,000 Dreamers in Connecticut right now who are at risk of removal if the DACA repeal goes into effect. Guess who's going to be responsible for determining whether or not that happens? It's going to be lawyers who go into court, just like they did earlier this week in Washington, D.C., and convinced a federal judge to order the Trump administration to continue accepting applicants into the DACA program. That's where these fights end up mattering. And with respect to the authority of the Attorney General here in Connecticut, the Attorney General is not going to be able to stop ICE from deporting somebody that they have a final order of removal for. But here's what the Attorney General can do. Because all of these deportations are increasing, the bar, the immigration bar, is understaffed. We don't have enough lawyers to represent families that are caught up in removal proceedings. So what I've proposed is having the Attorney General, using the power of the Attorney General's office to convene the immigration bar, the legal clinics, individuals in the legal community who want to provide these services pro bono, and to get them trained up so that we have a core of lawyers who definitely want to help people in need, who are able to go into court and defend their rights. That's something that the Attorney General can do, and that's what I'm committed to doing.
Thank you.
Okay. Immigration is just a little too important to yes, me too. And by the way, it's completely accidental that the legislators are on one side and the public interest lawyers on the other.
They wouldn't want to go against us in court, Claire, I know that.
And I wouldn't want to go against them on the floor. So we both bring skills to the table, but that's it. Listen, attorney generals don't make immigration policy. I wish we did. It would be a very different world. And as the attorney general, what I would do is strongly advocate for having an impact about where and how immigration, ICE can detain undocumented immigrants, because I think it's a public safety issue. And the question was asked earlier of the Attorney General with respect to it, and I do not believe, first of all, it's black letter law that you can't force state and local law enforcement to enforce federal law. That's nice, and that's why we sanctuary cities work. But I don't believe that I should be able to detain undocumented immigrants in hospitals, or courthouses, or schools, or police stations. Because if you allow that, then the elderly and the sick can't go to the hospital. Kids aren't going to school. A battered woman couldn't report something to the police station, and somebody who has been robbed and needs justice is denied justice at the courthouse. And thus, to deny them access to the places of justice in our society would create an underclass that is subject to exploitation. And we really need to do everything to stop that. I think it's a public safety issue, and that's where I would be putting my fight, to ensure that places of public safety, where it impacts the overall public safety of our state, that ICE should not be allowed to retain them.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your support for the rights of immigrants. I want to just allow the other three candidates to talk specifically about what you can do. It's a shame that the Trust Act reform didn't get out of committee. The Trust Act was certainly very well intentioned and made sense at the time, and we now know from experience it's not working. And we have marshals in the courts, we have prison officials, we have prosecutors conferring with ICE and unofficially detaining immigrants until ICE can pick them up, voluntarily notifying ICE. We have ICE officials incognito going into our prisons and interviewing women at York without without disclosing that they're going to use this to then detain them for deportation. I'd like to know concretely, we all hope we'll have stronger laws someday from the legislature, but for now, in this reality, what can you do as Attorney General to put some teeth behind the intent of the trust act?
Okay. So I think it's a couple things, and one is the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, has threatened lawsuits against the states to dismantle things like the Trust Act, laws like the Trust Act, and we have to prepare for that battle. That's number one. We have to enforce the Trust Act, and I think that the Attorney General can play a powerful role in trying to do that. I disagree with Chris that the Attorney General can't stop a final order of deportation. So attorneys general across the country rose up with respect to the travel ban, and they linked arms, and they demonstrated their strength in court in trying to stop that effort by the Trump administration. But here at the state level, Paul and I in particular worked together on the case of the Huangs. And the Huangs are in Farmington, and they faced a final order of deportation, and it looked pretty bleak in court. But being in court is only one tool in the toolbox. And you need to bring all pressure to bear on ICE and, and the public process on immigration judges and authorities. And so what I did was I reached out to the governor, with whom I have a very strong relationship. I said, Governor, you need to meet with the Huangs and get engaged. And he did, and then in his office he said, I'm going to call ICE right now. And he called 3 different officials, and he persuaded them to stop the final order of deportation on that day. And I said to the governor, you must have been very persuasive. And he said, no, I was really pissed off. And that's again, the fullness of the job, being able to use those relationships and pushing all of the levers at once, not just filing motions and not just going to court, but using the full bully pulpit to protect residents here in Connecticut. That's what we have to do, because you're right. The powers, the straight up powers under the law are limited by the law, and they're limited by the process, but you have to do more than that to keep people safe here in Connecticut.
Just a quick follow-up. So this similar question was asked of George Jepson this morning. He said, yes, I'll look into it. I think if it's true that you're going into our state courts and state hospitals, I think it's important. You're presenting evidence, verbal evidence to us. We need, I shouldn't say, George Jepson at this point needs concrete evidence presented to him, so then he can go after that and try to protect him, protect our courts and our hospitals from this activity that shouldn't be going on there. So you can't just say verbally. If somehow, there might be privacy concerns, but if you can get some evidence to George in the short term, and then whoever wins here in the long term, that person can pursue it. But we need the hard evidence of what's going on here, because it's for us to pursue it and then potentially go to court and defend it.
It's been fully documented and admitted to. It's been
Okay.
fully
Well,
documented and admitted to.
Okay, if you can get us copies, then we'll take it.
Last question goes to Larry, because it's our 34th anniversary today, so if I don't do this today, it's just gonna suck. So.
Imagine what will happen if I ask a long question. So, you have mentioned that the State Election Committee and the Commission and the rules here in Connecticut make it possible for more people to run. And, but on the other hand, our group and grassroots groups across the state are hamstrung a little bit by that committee. In fact, one of our sister groups is being sued by the GOP down in Greenwich. So how do you strike a balance between big money and groups like us, who, if they put money in the basket, it's a couple of dollars, and we barely make enough to pay the janitor? How would you revive, what is the Attorney General's relationship with the Commission, and what are your views on how to keep big money out, but let small groups like us, which are really driving democracy right now, how can you protect us while still safeguarding against big money?
It's a great question. I'll go first, and I'll make it quick. Okay, there isn't a candidate running for statewide office right now who has any love or affection for SEEK. They are, they have a tough job. The Office of the Attorney General does actually represent SEEK. There's a section of them in the office, it's the Special Litigation Department represents SEEK and challenges there. So they have a hard time. And like I served, in addition to working full-time as an Assistant Attorney General, I served in elected office for 9 years on the municipal level, 5 years on the Board of Ed for and Town Council. And, at municipal level, you raise your own money and, you talk to all your friends and family. There's only so many friends and family you can get, and they're not going to get you to over $1 million to cover the costs you need in order to run a statewide campaign. So there is that necessary evil of how does SEEK, I think there's a lot of things I would have a long conversation with SEEK about with respect to how it's being administered and to make things easier, particularly for those of us who went straight to candidate committee as opposed to exploratory and then jump to candidate because I have 1/10 the money. That said, I think that what the wonderful thing, the only silver lining from the November 2016 election is this group and these groups like this. Because I ran for office 4 times before, and people were complacent. They were engaged. I was in West Hartford. It's a pretty engaged place, but they're complacent. I've gone all across the state over the past 4 months, talking to DTCs, talking to various indivisible and other kinds of groups, PANs and the like, and nobody's asleep. Everybody's alert. Everybody's engaged. Everybody's here, and that's thanks to you guys. You are here on a Saturday morning doing what you're doing, and that's going to make the difference, and that's why we're going to win in November.
So I was aware that Indivisible was trying to figure out what legal form it should take in order to, do everything it could politically, and that can be frustrating. What I would say is this: first of all, it seems to me that in the era of Citizens United, we need to be doing everything we can to ensure disclosure of funders. So that's why I've supported secondary and tertiary disclosure, so that when you have a shell organization like called, Citizens for Prosperity that's getting funded by, another group called People for Prosperity, that at some point you figure out who exactly is funding these groups. And that's probably the best we can do in the area of Citizens United. But I would say this, what's going to matter most for a group like yours is not how much money you can give, but how many people you can put on the street in the run-up to the next election. How many doors you can knock on, how many neighbors you can persuade to support candidates who represent your values. Because all of us, if we're in a primary, we're going to have about the same amount of money, and the same is true in a general election with the Republican candidate. The difference is going to be how many people are out there convincing their neighbors that our candidates represent the best for their future. And so let's make sure that we're focused on that.
Thanks. Okay, so apparently I lied, because Ginny, who's the head of our immigration group, also wants to ask one last question. So,
it's not a question, but it's back to what you started with, and talking about Miriam, who he visited and stood for and was able to participate in that. And I just wanted to share with you that the immigration team worked with her specifically and was very involved with having her being able to stay here. So I would like everybody who's on the immigration team to stand up. It's time for us to stand up. We have been working with over 15.
okay, now that everyone was standing up, you're not anymore. All right, thank you to all of the candidates. It was a phenomenal, phenomenal presentation from everyone. I think that all of you need to get to UConn by noon, is that correct?
No, they canceled
that.
Oh, marvelous, no wonder. Great. So the candidates will be around to answer some questions, but we will be splitting up into our working groups. The immigration group is going across the hall where Bennett is standing, and they're going into the chapel area. The environment group will be up front here in this room, and our whole Get Out the Vote team will be in the back where Gail is, please move, if you're in this room, staying in this room, please move your chairs so that that works. Okay, thank you.